way that science itself develops is testing its hypothesis empirically. And on the basis of the evidence and the facts which may contradict or falsify a hypothesis, correcting the hypothesis, coming up with a new one, extending it, and thereby hopefully enabling knowledge to progress to a certain extent. So that's from my perspective.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. And maybe a question that occurs to me, others may have thought of it too, is what happens when we shift discursive registers in this way? You know, there's clear parallels, as you pointed out, between contemplation and theory, active life and practice, but these are formulated in such different kind of conceptual domains. What happens when we shift from one of these domains to another, and what are the implications or the trajectories of implication associated with these different vocabularies?
I think we're ready if somebody wants to develop a new theme.
Just two minor observations, Daniel, to follow up on what you were talking about, modern distractions and the whole issue of time. And I'd like to go back to the civil rights movement in the 60s and the peace movement of the 60s. And I myself lived in New York at the time. And one of the things I tell my grown children is one of my greatest guilt is that I didn't make the time to go to the South and be involved in the civil rights movement. I was busy with studies. I just felt I couldn't spare the time. And what I see is that now I'm retired. I have lots of time, but the same rationale, the same habits perseverate. And I think it's particularly important that people who have lots of more time, because they are retired, and I see lots of those in the audience here, that it's kind of urgent almost that they do a more active life while they can. Especially, I have friends who are active in Greenpeace, young people, and their fervor, their passion, in a way, needs to be tempered by the people of more experience and more wisdom, if you will. So it's just an observation that we, the more elderly or the elders in our community, I hate the word should, but I think are more obligated to get involved while they can, because it's so easy to not do so.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that when I was thinking about today's conversation, that the poles of this tension have their ways of creating different kinds of paralysis, you know, and we talk about the paralysis of analysis. You know, this is the to go back to the language between kind of practice and theory, the frustration people can feel who are deeply embedded in practice that the theorists aren't helping out, right, and they're spending their time elaborating concepts. And on the other hand, as you were saying, the need for focus and for contemplative vision in the midst of many activities. And that's, to go back to the point, if there's no theory, if there's no kind of conceptual way of deciding what's important, making some priorities, activity just becomes activity for its own sake. So this tension is very much involved in practical things. It seems to me, too, that the liveliness of contemplation doesn't come out of just kind of the world of contemplation itself. It comes out of the experience of activity. But that's where the relevance registers deep in us and says, this means something. You know, this is energizing because of that experience. You know, the experience in having actually done work with these concepts. Now, one of the things that I'm a little bit anxious about or nervous about here is the way I was just using the language of concept and we were talking about theory. These are really head kind of terms about thinking and brain and kind of analyzing things. The contemplative life has a register of wanting to kind of engage with the energies that are of many forms, not just intellectual ones, but ones of heart and of feeling and instinct, of worship, these kinds of elements of human experience that are broader than just the capacity of the brain to make particular decisions and analyses and so on. So that's part of what I was saying about what happens when we switch registers between these different kinds of terminologies. Other follow-ups on that particular
Yeah, does anybody
point?
have a comment on that? Right. I think I'd like to say a little something here. I think that there's often a tendency for, particularly I guess in our culture, for the active life to overwhelm the contemplative. And the balance gets lost. I like the idea of a tension between the two. I think that's what has to be maintained. But if it's a tension, it's got to be a tension where each affects the other, right? And it's often the case that when you get involved in activism, I've been involved a little bit in activism, and I've seen this happen. I mean, people's appreciation, just their, okay, I'll say intellectual appreciation of what's going on in the world, gets warped. I mean, they tend to theorize about it in such a way that it will support the ends of their active endeavors, right? It seems to be a person does have to step back from activism to do proper contemplation. You have to step back from that and look again at just what's going on. I agree with you to some extent that theorizing is not just a matter of, what would we say, rational calculations, etc. The heart's involved in it, of course. But the heart can be involved in a way which is not directly active. And you have to watch that all the time. I would say, for example, that evangelism is a case where the active life has overtaken the contemplative and forced it into a kind of subservient position. And that a lot of Christian theology is really the result of that. Okay, that's enough from me. Do you want to respond to that, or should
Well, as the child of missionary parents, I would say that this is deep in my own experience. I didn't grow up in a family that went to university, and I'm the first person in my family, the first generation university person, and so on. I think what drove me to it, instinctually, I didn't know what that was the desire for that contemplative. That was, I think, missing in the programmatic idea of what was being conveyed in the evangelical tradition. I would want to add that there's lots of deep theoretical contemplation in evangelical circles that surprises me often. So there's tensions within many communities, I would think. But I take your point.
As I'm listening to our conversation today, I think anytime I hear sort of one versus another, I always like to introduce a third. And I think that the third in our very active life is pause, in whatever way we want to describe that, whether it's meditation or just pause, space. And I think that's what's often missing.
I'm thinking about the pause as part of the rhythm of any breath. I mean, you think about how many spiritual traditions focus on breath and why breath is, the intake, the outtake, the interdependence. But the pause between the in and the out is built into that rhythm, right? And there's as we're talking about stepping back for the contemplative, we have this kind of, this is the way language gets us into metaphors that have their own limitation. seems to me that there is the stepping back in the sense of creating that pause. But that's part of the rhythm of doing, of being, and of living. It isn't always, and I think this is back to the point that Peter was making very early from Jesuit tradition, that the activities of life have the potential to be contemplative in themselves, right? And that if you can learn to attend to their life-giving richness, that remarkable activity can be contemplative itself. It needs the pause. It needs the pause in it, like breath does. But it can be rhythmic in that way. And I think, this is my own experience, is that, I don't just stay in meditation all day. There's that rhythm back and forth. And a question that I'm sure many of us live with is, what is the residual effect of the first stroke of that rhythm in the next part of the intake and the outtake?
Just a little anecdote. I lived in Chicago in the 60s, and I was on the west side when the Black Panthers were at their height, just down the street from where a whole bunch of them were assassinated by the Chicago Police Department and a number of others. And as most of you know, they had a very vigorous form of Marxism. I'm not sure vigorous is the right word to use, but I think I'll use it anyways. And there was this incident. A number of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions was operating at Santa Barbara under Robert Maynard Hutchins, the former president of the University of Chicago. And he invited Thomas Merton to come. And Thomas Merton, for those of you who may be unaware of it, is probably in the writing of the history of America, the last half of the 20th century, will get more than a footnote, because he was a very transformative person from a Cistercian monastery. He was a writer, and he worked for the transformation both of monasticism and of the church and of the society. He was deeply engaged with race issues and with issues of nuclear war and many other things, and did that from his hermitage. In any case, he traveled to Bangkok to a gathering, one of the rare gatherings of Christian monastics, contemplatives, and Buddhist and Hindu monastics as well. And that is, in fact, where he died on that, when he was over there. But on his way, he stopped at Santa Barbara because Robert Maynard Hutchins asked him to drop in at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. And when he arrived, Hutchins was standing there talking to a number of Black Panthers who he had also invited. And Hutchins introduced Merton to the Black Panthers and said, "This is Thomas Merton, he's a monk." And the Black Panthers all shot back, "We're monks too." So what do they mean? I think this has to do with disciplines around action and analysis and, if I've understood you correctly, a kind of contemplation which isn't the captive of analysis.
What were the three terms? The analysis, action, and contemplation, which is not a form of analysis.
Well, or at least isn't captured by it.
Captured by analysis. Okay, so not captured as in the sense of in paralyzed. Yes, yes. What really catches my ear in what you were saying with this anecdote is about the disciplinary nature that that's what we're talking, for me, that's the core of the idea of what is the spiritual, is those energies that drive us, that we find compelling and that are generative of our creativity, our desire to be active, to do and to work. And then let's call it the contemplative, somewhere between the analytical and contemplative element.